see. I was scrolling idly down my Facebook kind of page and came across a rather, well, just a horrible video of an emaciated orangutan with its baby just kind of clinging on to mum for life. And people trying to put a drip into this orangutan's arm just to try and help it to survive, I guess. And alongside or underneath the video were these words: "You are killing orangutans by buying these products." And I thought to myself, oh, help, I have no idea. Felt immediately sort of a pang of guilt. How would I ever know what products, who's buying it, how am I buying it, when? And whether it's whether it's consuming palm oil, or using plastic straws, or neglecting to insulate my loft space, I guess there are plenty of people giving me very good reasons for feeling guilty in certain respects. Perhaps more than ever in the West, we have become consumed with this cry to do what is right, and in particular to seek justice, whether it's justice for the planet, of which we're only stewards, or particularly the welfare of human beings, to provide for the needy, to protect the vulnerable, whatever, to ensure equality for all, whatever it may be. And when you start to ask questions about humanity and human rights, inevitably you sort of look for foundations in certain respects. So you start to say, well, what do we mean by human rights? And why do people have them? And where do they come from? And how do we defend them? And so on. And one answer is quite simply to say, well, human rights exist because we say they exist. It's kind of just a given. It's a just because we say so argument, that human beings are different from the rest of the creatures on the planet in some way. But as often been pointed out, there's a kind of a problem with that, because all you can do is, if it's a just because we say so argument, all we can do is pressure people into accepting human rights rather than persuade people. Because we're not really giving a foundation for them, we're just saying it's just so. And this is the standard that we've agreed to. And if someone says, well, says who, and in what way, and how, and why, well, we don't necessarily have an answer. So we struggle, don't we? We struggle with who has those rights, how far they extend, when they begin, when they end, and so on. New York University professor Nicholas Walderston suggested that really you can't formulate a solid understanding of human rights from a secular ideal. He said it just doesn't work. He said you need to look elsewhere. And in one of his books, he makes the argument that the foundation for human rights, and therefore for justice, really lies in Christianity. And he's not a Christian himself in saying this, but he says that's really how you get to human rights. You have to go back to the Bible in some sense. He says there's something about the Christian doctrines that obligate us, compel and command us to treat other people with dignity and with respect. And the idea that you can draw a straight line from Christianity to a modern day understanding of human rights, the idea you can draw a straight line isn't unique to him. This is how Tom Holland, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, but the historian Tom Holland, who also crops up on our TV screens from time to time, this is how he, again, not someone who I believe to be a Christian in any way that you or I might call ourselves Christian, this is what he has to say about the idea of human rights and where they come from. And we're just going to watch 3 minutes from a short YouTube clip, I hope. Let's see. David's going to see if we can make this work. And we're hopeful. We just have to get it to come up on the screen. There we go. Anyone want to help out there? Okay, we're good.
by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of... Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. Mm-hmm. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor. Right. The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more. And it was kind of like, I was thinking, well, you know, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you know, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious, the religious and imperial context of late antiquity. And again, finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien, that, you know, there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that, again, seemed deeply, deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually, Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of, you know, urbane man with his property problems. You know, Paul never had any property; he just made tents. Yes. That in almost every, you know, what is it? Seven. That is the 7 letters that are people conventionally people absolutely accept. That, you know, and as Tom Wright was saying, you know, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted. Yes,
but also the way that the West has then moved on to shape, you know, concepts like international law, for instance. So the fact, you know, concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists
Paul really
and atheists,
is, you know, his letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of...
We'll put a link to that in the newsletter and to the article for the New Statesman that he wrote entitled "What I Got Wrong," where he acknowledges that he owes, as he said in that 3-minute clip, almost everything that he values as a modern Western individual, everything he values, he owes to Christianity. And he had never expected that to be the reality. But do you notice in the things that he attributes to Christianity there in that clip was human rights, in a world that had been remarkably cruel and exploitative before the revolutionary documents that we call the Gospels and the letters of Paul. I just thought it was a very, very interesting little 3 minutes from a man who doesn't seem to owe anything personally in terms of a Christian faith, but recognizes Christianity has shaped the world in ways we don't even know, we don't even understand. A cry for justice really has its origins in the Bible, I want to suggest. In this series, Making Sense of God, one of the things that we're trying to do is say, actually, the things that we value most about life depend, in essence, on Christianity being true. We probably just have never thought about it in that way before. So whether we're on the topic of love or meaning or truth or justice or morality, what Tom Holland is saying and what we would affirm as Christians is they actually depend on God. essentially. You see, here's Richard Dawkins' conclusion about the universe in which there is no God. He says, the universe has precisely the properties we should expect. If at bottom there is no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Blind, pitiless indifference. That's where atheism takes you in terms of your doctrine of life and the universe. And this is how Dawkins actually applied it. Listen to this. This is what he had to say. If someone used my views to justify a completely self-centered lifestyle, which involved trampling all over other people in any way they chose, I think I would be fairly hard put to argue against it. Wow. If anyone decided to be cruel rather than kind, Dawkins says, I would find it pretty difficult to argue against it. Because he believes the universe is a universe of blind, pitiless indifference. Do you see? You can't get to justice and equality from atheism. Now, please hear me. That is not to say people who don't have a Christian faith can't be incredibly kind and generous. They can if they want to be. But what I'm saying is they can't draw a line from their core beliefs to being kind as an obligation. Whereas, as we'll see, Christianity insists on the equality before God of every human being and the call to be compassionate and generous and kind to every human being as God gives us opportunities. It's logical and consistent for the Christian to argue that cause. Paul Kalanithi was a brilliant neurosurgeon whose life was tragically cut short at the age of 37. Just months before he died, he wrote a bestseller, still a bestseller today, called When Breath Becomes Air. The irony was he was a neurosurgeon who then discovered he had brain cancer. And that was what killed him. Towards the end of the book, he explains how his atheism eventually gave way. He says this: the problem with atheism eventually became evident. To banish God from the world is also to banish love, hate, and meaning. And he wasn't ready to accept that world. He said, atheism asks us to consider a world that is self-evidently not the world we live in. Atheism asks us to consider a world that is self-evidently not the world we live in. In other words, what he came to find was that the biggest problem with atheism is it's unlivable. Just as Dawkins said, you can choose to be cruel or kind, and I can't argue with whichever approach you take to life as an atheist. Dawkins' own conclusion. And the problem is, we demand justice and equality and human rights. And atheism undermines justice, equality, and human rights. If you insist that life is nasty, brutish, and short, that's hardly a foundation for obligating people to treat each other well. Well, what is the Christian response? Well, very briefly, I'm going to sketch a response for you. Justice is founded on the nature of human beings. It's who we are that means that justice needs to be upheld. Martin Luther King, founder of the civil rights movement in the United States, made his case for civil rights and human rights from Genesis chapter 1, from the idea that every human being is made in the image of God, equally so. Every human being is therefore equal in the eyes of God, and therefore what is done in heaven must be done on earth. Every human being on earth must treat every other human being on earth as equal, because we each made in the image of God. He roots it in the opening chapter of the whole Bible. What it means to be human demands us to treat each other well. If you believe everybody else in this room bears the image of God. Here's how C.S. Lewis put it in his own unique way. He says, there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to our life as the life of a gnat. But human beings are immortal. It is the immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. You have never met a mere mortal, is what C.S. Lewis says, if you believe that human beings bear the image of God. But it's not just who we are that demands justice be done. It's also who God is that demands that justice be done. So we read verses like this, Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 31. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker. But whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Do you see? If we believe that human beings are made in the image of God, we treat them well because of who they are. But if we believe that human beings are made in the image of God, we treat them well because of who God is. It is God who is their maker. So if I ignore the needs of the oppressed and the marginalized and the poor, if I ignore them, I mock their maker. I mock God. So why do we cry justice? Human beings made in the image of God. Secondly, because God himself is mocked if we fail to stand up to the needs of human beings. But supremely, it is Jesus who teaches us not just to seek justice for people, but to actually go beyond justice and even to love our enemies. It's the most radical ethic of all. No one has said anything quite like this before or since. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44, when Jesus says to his disciples, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Just as Jesus, when the soldiers were driving the nails into his hands as they prepared to crucify him, prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? Why would Jesus ever call us to take human rights that far? Well, because in one sense, the whole story of the Bible is of a God who chose to love his enemies. Human beings in rebellion against him, God chose to love us when we were rebels. We, in turn, must choose to love our enemies and pray for them. Would you turn back to that reading that we had in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, sorry. It's really well known. I appreciate that, and also incredibly, incredibly powerful. The parable of the Good Samaritan. So verse 25, you've got a young lawyer. He wants to put Jesus to the test. He says basically to Jesus, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what does your Bible say? What does the law say?" And he answered, he summarized the law in a familiar way. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and live." But he wanted to justify himself. He wanted to demonstrate to Jesus that he was someone who was living God's way, who was fulfilling the law. He wanted to justify himself, and so he said, "Who is my neighbor?" I mean, how far does this extend, in other words? Who am I obligated to help and to serve and to love? And Jesus tells this parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? And it's the story of a Jewish man. He's going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's about 17 miles. It's a drop of about 3,000 feet. And so he's going through sort of valleys and ravines, and there are mountains on either side. It's not exactly a safe place to be walking. And he's attacked by robbers, and it seems from what I read in the text that he's kind of left for dead. And as he lies there, half dead, 3 different men pass by. The first 2 are religious leaders from Israel. First one is a priest, and the second one a Levite. And they choose to do nothing. Do they know that this man is not a fellow Jew is a fellow Jew? Do they think they should come to his aid? We don't know. We're not told why they didn't stop. Then a Samaritan. Of course, the Samaritans were the enemies of the Jews, half-breeds. He does stop to help this man. Now, stopping itself was a risk. Because what does he know after all? He knows that this is exactly the kind of place you're going to get mugged. He knows it because he's looking at a man who's been beaten to a pulp. If you see someone whose life has been taken like that, isn't your first instinct to run, to get out of there? And he stops. That's a risk in itself. He could have been attacked. Maybe it was an ambush. Maybe people were waiting for someone to come and stop and come to this man's aid, and they were going to get him as well. But he stops. And he doesn't just stop briefly, does he? He extends an extraordinary amount of compassion. Do you see verse 33? He took pity on him. He went and bandaged his wounds. He pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And then he paid so that he could stay there even longer, and said, when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, I don't know when you ask the questions around your table what it meant for you to extend help to a stranger. I don't know whether it was carrying somebody's suitcase at the bottom of some steps up to the top, seeing someone trying to fix a broken car. I don't know who it was you helped, how far you went, but have you ever gone as far as this? Have you ever given this much time, this much money? And have you ever done that for a stranger? Someone who is never going to be able to repay you in kind? Not me. So here's one person's summary of what Jesus is teaching. Where need exists, race, nationality, gender, color, political allegiance must not stop us from being the neighbor Christ calls us to be. To put it more simply, the world is your neighbor. The world. To be a neighbor is to simply come to anyone's aid that we see an opportunity to do so. We don't put limits. We don't put boundaries. We're a helper to anyone in need. That's the better question. Jesus is giving the most radical answer, isn't he? What does it mean to love your neighbor? Jesus won't put limits on it. He just won't. Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said, to love one's neighbor means to will, to exist, equality for every human being without exception. To love your neighbor is to want every human being to have equality. One cannot define one's neighbor. One essentially can only be a neighbor. Now the problem is, who could ever live up to these standards? How could I be a neighbor to the world? How could I ever extend that degree of love and concern? And of course, the reality is, ultimately, none of us can ever turn out to be the Good Samaritan. What we actually need is a great Samaritan called Jesus. Because you see, Jesus came to our aid, not just when we were injured, but when we were spiritually dead. Even though we were his enemies, Jesus didn't walk by, but had compassion upon us. He came to us and saved us. He didn't just risk his life, he gave up his life. And on the cross, he didn't just pay 2 coins to cover our time in the inn, but he paid with his life for our sins. Jesus is the great Samaritan. God saw our state and didn't walk by. had compassion, mercy, and love. And it's because we've experienced the love of a neighbor in Jesus that we now have a new powerful motivation to be a neighbor to the world. It's because we've experienced and received it first that we're able to offer it in return. It's not merely that we see human beings made in the image of God and we think we should come to their help. It's that we know that Jesus stopped for us. He stopped and went to the cross for us. He suffered and died for us to restore us to health. And then he calls upon us as his people to follow his lead and follow his example. Because we have received his love, maybe, just maybe, we can begin to offer our love in return to a needy world and to seek for all human beings the love of a neighbor. Someone has said, if you want to be a passionate advocate of human rights, there really is no other foundation than the one put forth by Jesus.